the particular structure of a language, or even the universal patterns in all languages. What's important is that there's structure in the first place. In this lecture, we'll talk about how the mind is wired from birth to see structure in language and use structure to organize and communicate information. As with other aspects of language development, this innate mechanism interacts with linguistic experience over childhood to allow the design of language to emerge. The syntax and grammar at the core of a language rely on the ability to produce, recognize, and predict patterns. There's no question that pattern processing is one of the most widespread and useful mechanisms that humans innately possess. There are countless examples, but let's focus on one that has life and death consequences: the human immune system. Our immune system employs an arsenal of innate pattern detectors. There are two general types of defense. On the front line, there's the primitive immune system. This system is evolutionarily ancient, and it's composed of so-called pattern recognition receptors. These receptors are pre-designed to detect molecular signatures of known dangerous molecules. There's no learning necessary for these receptors. They're like soldiers who are born knowing exactly who their mortal enemies are, as well as exactly how to fight them. The next line of defense is the adaptive or acquired immune system, which is triggered by the primitive system. The adaptive system is also innate, but it requires experience with specific invaders to learn how to fight them effectively. This learning happens through a process of trial and error, and it remains quite flexible throughout one's lifetime. Both of these immune systems fundamentally rely on processing patterns. The difference is that in the case of the primitive system, the patterns are preset and rigid, but for the adaptive system, they are open and flexible. If this is sounding familiar, that's good. Connecting back to earlier lectures, I hope you can see how this relates to domain-specific and domain general mechanisms. Does the human mind come into the world with pattern recognition skills specifically suited for language? Or does it innately possess more general pattern recognition abilities that get used for many things in addition to language? I'd like you to keep these two questions in mind for this final lecture on development. Although the evidence favors the more domain general mechanisms, this is still an ongoing debate. Let me take you back a couple of lectures. Earlier, we discussed how infants are like little scientists who constantly collect data and test hypotheses about their world. But the key to scientific success is to continue the cycle over and over and over. After you test a hypothesis, the results affect future data collection, which then leads to new hypotheses and tests, and the cycle repeats. This is the nature of science, and it's just as natural for babies, too. The general process underlying this never-ending cycle is a type of probabilistic learning mechanism called Bayesian learning. The basic idea is this: we make predictions about the world based on a combination of two things: current evidence and prior knowledge. The power of Bayesian learning is that once we test a prediction or change our prior knowledge, it updates the probability of future predictions. Just like the scientific method, this cycle is on a never-ending loop. Let's try a real-world example with syntactic development. Suppose a 3-year-old hears the following novel sentence: "The dog tibs the boy." Because tibs is a new word, the child has to determine what type of speech it is. Let's suppose the child is considering two choices: a verb, meaning something like licking or biting, or a noun, meaning something like food. Now, there's a 50-50 chance of both of those being right from the child's perspective. Based on this, do you think the child would essentially let a coin toss decide whether the word was a verb or a noun? If you said no, you just acted in a very Bayesian way. In addition to considering this 50-50 chance, the child will most certainly also consider past knowledge about the way English syntax and grammar work. For example, the child would probably call up prior knowledge that most verbs are wedged between nouns, between two nouns. When you add that to the equation, the prediction that Tibbs is a verb and not a noun seems much more plausible. Now, imagine two new scenarios. In one scenario, the child hears the word Tibbs again, but this time in a new sentence between two different nouns. Now the child has even more data that confirm the original prediction, and this would increase the confidence that Tibbs is indeed a verb. But how about this scenario? Suppose the child didn't actually hear the whole sentence the first time, but the second time they did. And this is what they heard. The dog Tibbs the boy ate made him sick. Did your brain just do a double take? This is another example of a garden path sentence, and it illustrates the power of prior knowledge. To make sense of this new sentence, you had to realize that dog was not a noun preceding a verb. It was actually an adjective modifying a noun. Dog Tibbs may be another word for dog food. With this knowledge in mind, try the sentence again. The dog Tibbs the boy ate made him sick. With this new information, the child would have to update the contents of prior knowledge in the following way. In cases of complex embedded clauses, sometimes a noun occurs in a position where a verb typically goes. Just to drive the point home, let's do another example of something familiar. Recall Jenny Safran's study showing that 8-month-olds could learn word boundaries from only 2 minutes of speech input. One Bayesian way to think of this finding is that children use this 2 minutes of exposure to gather evidence about which syllables co-occurred and which ones did not, and they combined this information with their prior knowledge of English syllables. If 8-month-olds can pick out regularities from a mere 2 minutes of speech, they no doubt have already extracted a few basic rules from their 8 months of previous exposure to English syllables. This combination of new evidence and prior knowledge is what guided them to identify words and word boundaries in the experiment. Let me remind you that this sort of linguistic pattern recognition has been shown even in one-day-old babies, so the capacity for Bayesian learning appears to be an innate mechanism for language acquisition. To help you appreciate the power of this innate knowledge or this innate mechanism, I want to highlight 3 important things about Bayesian learning. First, it allows for very fluid and dynamic processes of educated guessing. Predictions can constantly be updated based on new evidence. Second, learning an important new piece of information can change your prior knowledge, and this can radically change how you interpret patterns of evidence. For example, suppose you're romantically interested in someone, but that person always seems to ignore you in a social group. Based on these observations, you might hypothesize that the person has no interest in you at all. But now imagine that a mutual friend tells you that your romantic interest is also very interested in you, but is extremely shy. This new knowledge would cause you to completely reinterpret the evidence up to that point. And here's the third thing. Bayesian learning allows for the creation of powerful but flexible rules about the world. This is different from traditional empiricist explanations about how people learn from experience. For example, behaviorists like Watson, Skinner, and Pavlov argued that people learn new things just by making superficial associations between one thing and another. For these behaviorists, all learning is surface learning. There are no deep and abstract rules to guide behavior. This view was vigorously challenged by Noam Chomsky back in the 1950s when he debated B.F. Skinner about language learning. Chomsky argued that this superficial learning could not account for the apparent rule-like behavior of children during language acquisition. Chomsky astutely pointed out that there is a lot of abstract learning that goes beyond the superficial linguistic input. For example, why do children over-regularize verbs and nouns, like when they say goad and fishes, if they've never heard those words before? As you know, Chomsky's answer was to build in an innate language-specific mechanism to explain these and other rule-like occurrences. However, Bayesian learning provides a more general alternative. The advantage is that nothing specific to language needs to be built in. Rather, a general mechanism can respond to linguistic input and generate specific rules based on experience alone. It's for this reason that domain general Bayesian theories are so attractive. They allow learners to create complex linguistic rules and representations without building them in from the start. Before we finish up with Bayesian learning, I want to emphasize just how general a tool this is. Not only is it involved in many other aspects of human cognition, like perception, attention, and decision-making, but it applies to non-human thinking too. It appears that some species, like bees and dogs, they're capable of Bayesian learning, so it seems to be an evolutionarily conserved mechanism across species. And it doesn't stop there. There are variants of Bayesian learning, sometimes called Bayesian deep learning, that don't even require biological brains at all. Artificial intelligence is increasingly using this form of learning. Everything from email spam filters to computer chess masters and self-driving cars to cancer screening tests. There's even chilling talk of the military using these Bayesian mechanisms to train autonomous attack drones. This is just the start, and you can expect to see many more examples of Bayesian applications in the years to come. Bayesian learning is a nice example of a constraint on language acquisition that brings something extra to the learning process. In the past few lectures, we've discussed other examples of this too, like mutual exclusivity in word learning or theory of mind and understanding intention. But sometimes there are guides on language learning that involve subtracting rather than adding. One of my favorite examples illustrating this is a hypothesis by Alyssa Newport, aptly named the less is more hypothesis. Newport's idea arose in response to a long-standing observation in language learning. Children learn language better than adults, a lot better. We know this from decades of research on second language learning, or L2 learning for short, where children consistently outperform adults in L2 pronunciation, morphology, and complex syntax. If you recall, Pat Kuhl had one explanation for